Hi, and thank you and welcome to our webinar about border realities and border communities. I'm very excited today to be able to present to you some of the local Catholic service providers down at the border. Our webinar today is being recorded. At the end, we will have a robust section for question and answer. You can type your questions into the chat box. And we will also be sending out a recording of the webinar to everybody who registered, as well as a copy of the recording will be available on the Justice for Immigrants website. And so with that, I am going to give a little bit of an introduction and introduce our speakers, and we're going to get started. For many of you who work on the immigration issue or have been working on it in the last 4 years, a number of changes have occurred, and those at the border have been probably among the most stark. We have seen the implementation of certain policies such as the migrant protection protocols and the asylum cooperation agreements, which have eviscerated asylum rights in our country and have created a situation of large numbers of asylum seekers waiting on the Mexico side to access due process protections from the US government. It is estimated that approximately 65,000 individuals at one point or another have been involved in the Migrant Protection Protocol program, whether they are still waiting in Mexico to access those protections, they have at one time been enrolled, or an additional population of individuals who in the last couple months may have also been involved. It has created a changed dynamic at the border, both on the US and the Mexico side. We are going to hear from service providers who, at the beginning of this administration, were dealing with large numbers of women and children and families on the US side in their shelters, who are now seeing many of those similar type of populations waiting in Mexico in dire circumstances. Our speakers today are going to talk about the realities of what they are seeing and experiencing at the border on the Mexico side. They're going to talk about the realities of what they're seeing and experiencing on the US side. We're going to talk about COVID-19 and how it's impacting their work, and then give recommendations for a new administration and for new policy making kind of priorities that we're hopeful to see as it relates to border communities and the rights of asylum seekers. And so with that, I'm going to move forward with introducing our speakers. Like I mentioned, our speakers are going to share a little bit on this webinar, and then at the end, we're going to have time for question and answer. You are free to type in those questions, and also we will be recording these. And if you want to have follow up with the speakers, we are happy to connect you as well if there's not enough time. So I'm going to go alphabetically because we have so many great speakers. But first, Father Sean Carroll is the Executive Director of the Kino Border Initiative, which is centered in Nogales, Mexico, and has a presence also in Nogales, Arizona. And he's going to be talking about the reality of what his organization is seeing in Mexico. Teresa Cavendish is the Director of Operations for Casa Alitas at Catholic Community Services of Southern Arizona. And she's going to be speaking about the US experience and what they are seeing on the US side as it relates to asylum seekers, but also some of the realities of where we are now with COVID-19. Dylan Corbett is the Executive Director of the Hope Border Institute. He's going to close us out and give some recommendations as to how we can move forward and making sure that we include the perspective of local organizations and also keep our humanitarian and human-focused principles at play while we make and look for new solutions to this issue. And lastly, Sister Norma Pimentel, who's the Executive Director of Catholic Charities of the Rio Grande Valley. She's going to talk a little bit about some of the realities of COVID-19, how it's affected her community in the Rio Grande Valley, and also how she's seeing that play out on the Mexico side. So at this time, I'm going to move forward and ask Father Sean to go ahead and speak. And as I mentioned, this will be recorded and we will have an ample question and answer section at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley, and really grateful to be part of this wonderful panel and this great webinar. So border reality in Mexico. I think the main point I want to make, just starting out, is just the amount of time that people are waiting to access the asylum process. And I think if you look along the border, from one source I have, it's anywhere from 6 to 14 months. So in Nogales, Sonora, I'd say it's at least a year, maybe 13 months. And those are people who have been sent back under the migrant protection protocols, as Ashley mentioned, to wait to access their court date, which has been postponed because of COVID. There are people who have been crossing the border and then deported. I guess people are having trouble hearing me. Let's see.
If you keep talking straight, I think people can hear you.
Okay, I'll try to get closer. So people sent back under migrant protection protocols. People have been deported under Title 42 with the Center for Disease Control, whereas before people were they'd be spend time in detention, and then if they pass a credible fear interview, be able to access the asylum process. Now they're being deported back to Mexico, and part of what we're seeing, which we saw years ago, but it stopped, are expulsions at night, and of course that increases people's vulnerability. So the issues, I think, are many that people are facing in Mexico. One is access to a safe place to live. So we have testimonies from people, especially Cubans and Venezuelans, who have had to move a number of times because people there find out they're from Cuba, they're from Venezuela, and they think that they have family in the U.S. and they can extort them for money, and so people being extorted, being approached with that intent in mind, and people being forced to move because of that reason. Access to safety, which has been an ongoing issue over the years, but I'd say particularly intense and very real during these months. I think of a mom and 2 children from southern Mexico who come to our center every day for meals, and they've been threatened twice on the way of being kidnapped. And even though she has the great fear, she has a great need for the food and for meals for herself and her children. Access to work. So with this long wait and just the uncertainty about when access to asylum will happen to the process, there have been a number of people with the desire to find work. That can be hard to do if they're not from Mexico because it's difficult to obtain the documents. And so some people in that situation can access work in the informal sector, which has its risks. But also people from Mexico, they can access, they have at least the potential to access work in Mexico, which can be a help, but that can be a challenge at the same time. We have a livelihood project, in fact, at the Kino Board Initiative, which is precisely doing that, is helping the people to find work and to provide accompaniment and education, other services that are a help to them. Access to food, access to education for children. It's so with families waiting many months, they've had trouble accessing the educational system in Mexico. We've had a collaboration with Save the Children to try to provide some programming for them, but I think that's an ongoing challenge. I think the last thing I mentioned is just that with the prospect of the asylum process opening at some point, that it really raises the kind of whole question of the list, because that's the way the process was managed before at border crossing points, was with a list that people would add themselves to when they arrived at the border. And I think the reality from what I'm seeing is that at some border crossings, that list is not accessible, and at other places it is. In Nogales, it's not accessible, and that's something we're working on so that when the asylum process, people can access that process, that they can add their name to the list, that there's a clear and transparent process for presenting oneself at the port of entry and meeting with customs and requesting their credible fear interview. So I think our hopes are just that as soon as possible that this migrant protection protocols policy is ended. We believe that there are people in the US who are willing and able to sponsor families who are in immigration court proceedings to access the asylum process, and so that access should be made available and the border should be open, with the understanding, at least in our view, that we can protect public health, but also make asylum the process available to people, which is their right.
Thanks so much, Father Sean. And it's great to hear about all the work that Kino is doing. Next, we're going to hear from Teresa Cavendish, who's going to give a little bit of a picture about what her organization and the larger Tucson and Yuma community are seeing on the US side as it relates to dealing with COVID and, of course, the realities of the MPP and ACA situation.
So I'm Teresa Cavendish. I'm with the Casa Alitas program. We have been a shelter in Arizona, right on the kind of the other side of what Father Sean is doing. We are part of the Nogales sector for Border Patrol and DHS. So we have been in place for about 6 years now, and we've received, I don't know, 30,000 plus folks who have been brought to us by DHS, and we are the next step for them after they have been released by CBP, Border Patrol, or ICE. Once they're released into the community, the shelters like Casa Alitas are the next step. Since the Migrant Protection Protocol was fully implemented in Nogales, which was late, we were the last port of entry to receive the full implementation. That happened in January of this year. We went from receiving about 65 folks a day to receiving, 2 or 3 people a day, and then ultimately 2 or 3 people a week directly from DHS. We shifted our model so that we were also receiving folks who are coming out of immigration detention centers who were being released because of they'd achieved asylum, or when COVID became a thing that they had, that they were considered to be in particularly high risk. But what we are really seeing at Casa Alitas and in the Nogales sector is the folks who are implemented or impacted by MPP are incredibly desperate individuals. And so in as many cases as they can, they are attempting to bypass the ports of entry and find other ways through the process and into the US. Now, unfortunately, the significantly high majority of folks are being returned into border communities and are facing the situations that Father Sean was describing. In some cases now, individuals are not even being returned into port of entry communities. They're being returned into much smaller areas. There's some cities or townships that are along the Arizona-Mexico border that are, I'll give you an example. There's one called Sasabe. And Sasabe is a place, a little town where DHS has been known to release about 100 people a night into this community, into Mexico. And it's not a community that is able to manage the realities of that number of folks coming through. So people who are released there are very, very desperate to return into the US and make multiple attempts to do so. And sometimes ultimately are allowed in. However, this community is also heavily impacted by COVID. And so what we're finding is folks who are coming through in circumstances like that, there's about a 50% chance that they are COVID positive, 100% chance that they're COVID exposed, but 50% chance that they're positive. And so the reality for the shelters on the border now, on the US side, is you must be prepared to manage COVID. And Casalitas, we are in the type of a facility where we can quarantine people very easily. However, the process is the folks come in, they're tested for COVID the first or second day using the county testing facilities, and then they remain in quarantine with us until they either receive negative test results, or if they are positive, then they go through the full duration of their quarantine and medical treatment while they are with us. Then there are still a very few people who are able to come through who are not COVID exposed, presumably, well, they probably are, but are not immediately COVID evident. But the folks being allowed through have typically very serious medical conditions at this point. So it could be very advanced and difficult pregnancies, significant injuries to individuals. Typically, the injuries are people who have attempted to cross the border through other means out of desperation and have fallen off the walls, been injured as they were fleeing through the desert, or were injured by various encounters in the border community, sometimes assaults, violence, other forms of torture while they were attempting to get over. And even that is not enough to guarantee their admission into the US. Quite honestly, it is often a very merciful person within CBP or other who has made a personal determination that they're going to allow somebody to come through just out of compassion. What we are starting to see now is officers or individuals within DHS who feel slightly more emboldened to make compassionate choices for folks. And that has been since the election. And now the writing is on the wall for them. They realize that there's going to be a change. And so individual agents are making a determination that they can allow folks through. So today we have 4 people coming into Casalitas, 3 of whom are, pregnant women who are having complications. And it's because the officers feel that they're approaching a different environment and can make those decisions. What this means for the shelters when we ultimately look at a change in administration, before MPP, we had well over 30 active shelters going across the border communities, and our capacity as a network was quite significant. We were still over capacity virtually every day, but our capacity was quite good. Now we have maybe 10 active shelters with capacity concerns because we have to factor COVID into the new reality of how we receive and shelter the guests who come to us. DHS is also very aware that the infrastructure of the shelter network has almost collapsed, and DHS itself is reaching out and trying to understand what the capacities within the communities are. So we are facing, as a shelter network, the reality of business as usual, possibly early in the spring, but without the ability to provide the level of shelter and response that we had previously. So we are all working through a lot of creativity on figuring out how we can keep our folks safe and yet receive the number of folks who need us.
So thanks, Teresa, for giving us a little bit of a snapshot of how your community is responding. Next, we have Sister Norma Pimentel, who's the Executive Director of Catholic Charities Rio Grande Valley. And so Sister Norma has run the Humanitarian Respite Center there, also has been involved in some of the work in Matamoros with partners. She's going to talk a little bit about her experience as well as some of her work on the domestic side dealing with COVID and how they're preparing in that community. Sister?
Thank you, Ashley. Yes, well, thanks. I want to start by saying that our response here at the Rio Grande Valley at the border has been a very strong force. As a lead agency, we at our McAllen's shelter, we have received up to 200,000 people, families, refugees coming since 2014 to today. The numbers did change when we went into effect with the MPP policy. that changed from 1,000 a day to maybe a handful. We started with maybe 5. We've picked that up to more. Most recently, numbers that we have 5 to 10, and then we went to 20, and sometimes 50 people that we receive daily. Presently, more people are being released as days move forward. And so, but our focus has been in great part Matamoros, because that's where people that MPP are sent back because of MPP. That's where they are having to wait. And so I see our response, the success of our response being a collaborative effort, because we work together as a community and as different partners come together that are responding, both here in the US side at the border, but as well in Mexico, in Matamoros. We work very closely with the Mexican authorities to be able to establish a working relationship with all of us and making sure that we can address the needs that the families have at the camp right across the border from Bronx to Matamoros. And we started with almost 5,000 people there at the camp and moved now to a little less than 1,000 at the camp. The majority of the other thousands are still in the city of Matamoros, but mostly either in shelters like Casa Migrante or Casa Paz and other places. And so, or people just living in apartments. And so all of them supported by groups from the US, the majority of them, some from local Matamoros agencies. But in great part, we continue to address the needs of the families there as we move forward. The response of Catholic Charities in the Rio Grande Valley has been truly a blessing as far as COVID is concerned. We were blessed to receive a lot of funding from the federal government to respond to the COVID, those folks that have been affected by COVID. So we have funding available to the residents of the Rio Grande Valley to do that. And we also have partnered with the local university. We have a partnership so that they address the aspects of COVID. We have established a clinic at our respite center, and that with doctors and nurses and staff, so that they address all the basic needs of immigrants that are arriving daily at our center. And also anyone that is affected by COVID, we have opened a hotel specifically to address those folks that are either have been in contact with COVID or have been or actually have COVID. They are brought to us by Border Patrol directly to the hotel so that they can be quarantined and wait there for the number of days that they need to be there until they're tested negative. And so the clinic that we have, the partnership we have, the university, they're the ones that will test them before and after. And so that is how we have been responding to COVID here in the Valley. And at the respite center, what we do is we make sure we follow a COVID protocol, and our security guards that are at the door controlling who enters our facility will all be tested to see if they have fever. They will make sure they wash their hands. We have a washing hand unit outside. We also make sure that they wear a mask, and if they don't have a mask, we may provide one for them. And so we establish those social distancing amongst the people that we have, so that we try to make sure that should they be exposed to COVID, that we can control it as best as we can. If at any point we see that anybody may have come out positive with COVID and was introduced into the shelter, to the respite center, we will then disinfect the whole place completely and to try to control and make sure that that is as best possible. We don't have more cases of COVID. That is the protocol that we follow at the respite center, which has helped a lot. The people who end up at the hotel because of COVID, we will have partners that actually take food to them on a regular basis to make sure that they're fed. The food is dropped off at the door and of their room. And so it's the hotel that we have. It's an outside that they just go to their door and they will receive their food. And if they need to be tested, they will also be tested outside there where they're at. And so it has worked really great for us, you know, everybody. And the Border Patrol has already knows exactly what to do and just take people there directly. And those different people who are in collaboration with us and partnering to feed the families there will call us daily to find out if we have anybody at the hotel, and they make sure they provide excellent meals for them, you know, sometimes really good meals. So they're very happy to do that. As far as COVID is concerned here in the Rio Grande Valley, our local, state, and local government is responding to having different sites where people can actually get tested for free. And so that is done through funds from CARES, you know, funding. And so we have that in case we need to send people that are coming to us, volunteers or staff that need to be tested. We also send them to those locations that are set up throughout the Rio Grande Valley. Aside from that, we also are responding to the homeless that are locally in the area where our respite center is. And so we are receiving close between 25 and 30 people daily at night, since our facility is quite large. And so they actually come in at 8 in the evening and leave at 8 in the morning. And they have a designated area just for the homeless. They get fed, they get a chance to take a shower, get clean clothing, wash their clothes. We wash their clothes, and they're off the next day in the morning at 8 after breakfast. And so those are things that we're continuously doing since we went into MPP and our facility was available for them to bring them in and help them. And so as far as as we look forward to the possible changes that we're foreseeing that may happen, you know, because of the new administration, possibly asylum seekers being allowed into the United States, things that we might need to consider as far as the changes. For one, we have done is we started to convene all local shelters that existed before and invited any others that are interested in becoming a shelter should we need a shelter space aside from the respite center. We've already begun having our monthly meetings to basically talk about availability and challenges that we may be foreseeing ourselves as a shelter. And so it's going really well, and we're really voicing the things that we may be concerned of, one of which the major focus of concern has been COVID and how are we going to address that. And so, and the other one is space availability and how much space do we really have since COVID. Things changed completely. We're not going to be able to have, like for myself, we had a capacity for 1,200 people before COVID. During COVID, I would assume it would be almost half of that, if not less, you know. And so that would be the case with many other facilities shelters that are available here in the area of Rio Grande Valley, and their capacity is quite smaller. And so they definitely would be, space is a major concern, you know. And so those are two of the main things that we have raised as concerns should we go into a response with asylum seekers coming into the United States in greater masses. So one of the things that our health leaders that locally are assisting us right now with from the university, the health response, they're saying that our response should be that everybody should be placed in a isolation before they enter any shelter, because there is a window of 48 hours that everybody has the possibility of being exposed to COVID and not know. Even if you test them right now, you will not know that they have COVID or not, even though it comes out negative. The chances of maybe 2 days later, if you test them again, it will be positive if they have been exposed to COVID. And so they are recommending that if we are to respond to the great masses of asylum seekers entering, that every single person should be placed in isolation for at least 10 to 14 days. That's the recommendation. Ideally, that's the recommendation. That's the safest things for our country, so that people entering our country will be safe as they travel in the buses or airplanes or anything else. And so, but I think one of the things that we need to address as we look at the possibility of asylum seekers is available space. You know, what space do we have, and what capacity do we have, and or are we able to have hotels available for us to be able to have people there, or possibly maybe tents, you know, tents that can take the place of because they're temporary, but they can also provide space to house. We did that initially in 2014 ourselves. We had a whole parking lot with tents that was a complete operation. And so that would be something that we're looking at as a possible alternative to space, you know. And so definitely for funding, I think funding, one of the strongest, the best response would be funding that we get from the federal government for under CARES, you know, and that would definitely help us out a lot to address COVID if we should need that great number of people that we need to respond and quarantine or put in isolation. So I think that as far as my suggestions to what we could do are two things. One, I think that for COVID testing, we must have the state and the local authorities take responsibility for that. I think that would make it more successful, and that all of us, all the different NGOs, together with local legal leaders can create a plan so that we can respond appropriately to what we're to face if people are coming in greater numbers as asylum seekers. So those are my two recommendations overall.
Thanks, Sister Norma. It was great to hear about all the work that you are doing on both sides of the border and how you guys are dealing with COVID, and some thoughts for the future recommendations. And you kind of leave us at a great place for Dylan Corbett to give some of these larger recommendations you know, to future policymakers, the incoming Biden administration, as it relates to this situation that we find ourselves in, with the need to unwind some of these policies, restore due process, but also ensure compliance with immigration proceedings and access to services and family unity as themes that are very important. So I'm going to hand it off to Dylan Corbett, the Executive Director of Hope Border. Dylan's going to lay out some thoughts and some recommendations, and then we have a number of questions that we're going to answer. Please feel free to type in other ones. We will get to the questions after Dylan's remarks. So Dylan, thank you.
Sure. Can you hear me? Great. Thanks, Ashley. It's really good to be with all my colleagues from the border, with Ashley in Washington, and y'all from JFI, and Father Sean and Sister Norma and Teresa. Really honored to be with you all, and just a delight to see you on the screen, and everybody who's not on the screen that's joining us today. The situation here in El Paso, Ciudad Juarez, where I am, is probably very similar to what folks are seeing on the Arizona-Sonora border, and down where Sister is in South Texas and Matamoros and Brownsville. We have a situation here where asylum has basically, for all intents and purposes, effectively ended. Very few people are able to access asylum by coming to the US-Mexico border. There are very few people who are able to be paroled in or come into the United States by surrendering themselves to Border Patrol or to CBP. And that's for a variety of reasons, which you've heard, things like the migrant protection protocols or Remain in Mexico, which force people to negotiate their asylum cases from northern Mexican border communities like down in South Texas and like Ciudad Juarez here. And then there's the further complexity of the pandemic. So in the name of the pandemic right now, the US government has basically suspended asylum at the border. So beneath the weight of these two really very extraordinary decisions of the US government. There's a huge impact on people's ability to access asylum here at the US-Mexico border. So in Ciudad Juarez, because of the migrant protection protocols, 20,000 folk have been forced to go back to Mexico and into Ciudad Juarez. And in Ciudad Juarez, you've had blossom over the last couple of years, a major network of shelters, where before we had one shelter that was primarily handling the burden of the situation of migrants on the Mexican side, the one that's operated by the Catholic Church. Now you have a network of 17, 18 shelters and a very fluid population of migrants. So you have people who are in remain in Mexico. You have people who are newly arriving. You have people who are trying to cross the border and in an unauthorized fashion and have been returned in an expedited way. It's extremely fluid. You have people who are here long term because it can take months and over a year to if you're in remain in Mexico to see your case from start to end. So there are whole families that have, imagine all the different types of needs that they have in Ciudad Juarez. So an extremely complex situation, but our communities here on the border have stood up. And what you've heard from Teresa and Father Sean and Sister Norma are resilient communities that have been able, in the face of so much difficulty, the pressure of increased flows that we've had in the last 5 years at the border, and the pressure of fighting against very draconian policies at the border, you see in organizations like Catholic Charities, like Kino Born Initiative, communities that are resilient and able to stand up and meet the need. And that's what we need to these policies, because there's going to be pressure on the Biden administration to balance rolling back the worst of the Trump administration's policies, remain in Mexico, the Title 42 health orders, balance that with the reality of probably increased flows in the coming year from Latin America, from Central America in particular. Why are there going to be increased flows? A number of reasons. They're cyclical. We always see increased flows after the winter ends. People come up after the holidays, after Christmas. So there's a cyclical reality to that. There's also the reality of COVID-19, which is devastating these communities. It's devastating the budgets of these countries in Central America. There's greater food insecurity, et cetera, et cetera. And then the reality of the hurricanes. We saw 2 hurricanes, which were some of the worst in history. In they impacted places like Honduras and different parts of Guatemala in extreme ways. And these are only going to recur, but you're going to see the after effects of those border with Mexico. So there are going to be these flows. There's going to be the reality of a balancing act by the administration to roll back the policies, but also it's going to be politically difficult to do that in the face of greater influx. So we need to project as faith communities to handle this. In 2018, we had nearly 1 million arrivals to the US-Mexico border. They were coming to Nogales. They were coming to the Arizona border, to Ciudad Juarez in West Texas, to California. They were coming to South Texas. And you saw heroic efforts of local communities to be able to receive folks, to provide them hospitality, to do it in a dignified way, even under the burden of the current Trump administration. And so we need to be able we should have confidence, despite all the challenges and the added complexities of COVID, in border communities to be able to do these things. There's sufficient binational capacity within civil society and faith groups on the border if we have the cooperation, the assistance, and the empowerment of the US and Mexico governments. The US government should really start surging personnel and resources to the border now, providing additional PPE, providing the ability for rapid testing. Because there are so few people coming in, historic lows in terms of the folks we're allowing in, there is funding, existing funding and personnel available because we haven't tapped into ERO ICE operations because of these historic lows. So we already have the ability to do this. We're going to need to advocate for more. And I think that the USCCB is going to be asking folks to do that. Areas like foreign funding, surging additional or giving additional dollars for border communities to be able to do these things, investing in programs that work that are operated by United Nations agencies like UNHCR and IOM, and then helping out, really empowering local organizations like Sister Norma's, like Sean's, to be able to deal with the realities. This is also a time of great hope. As difficult as everything has been, folks on this call should really feel a lot of hope, because there are a lot of things, there are a lot of areas in which we can see change if we push hard enough. There are a lot of points of convergence with the incoming administration. We need to push them and hold them accountable to the promises that they've made. The moratorium, the 100-day moratorium on deportations, that affects border communities. DACA protections, reinstating and expanding them. We have about 7,000 folks who could benefit from DACA just here in El Paso and the greater West Texas area. We need to reinstate the Central American Minors Program that allows people to access asylum from Central America, and strengthen it to make it even better, because there are areas in which it can be better. We need to halt the ongoing border wall construction. There's border wall construction going on as I speak, just maybe a mile and back of my, where we're making the wall that we already have even taller. And wasting a lot of resources to do it. We need to withdraw from these safe third country agreements. The administration, there's already some hand wringing about that, but we need to push them on that. We need to halt, of course, as I said, the migrant protection protocols. Those are just the points of convergence. We need to review all of the existing policies to make sure that we roll back the worst excesses of the Trump administration. And then beyond reviewing, we need to redress. I'm excited that people are talking about, in the advocacy community, things like transitional justice. And even the administration has talked about transitional justice for the 666 children who still need to be reunited. There's been a lot of damage done in the last 4 years. And I'm glad that we're beginning to bring in the category of transitional justice into these debates. And then we need to reform. The reality is that the system, just as the Bush administration bequeathed to the Obama administration, bequeathed to the Trump administration will bequeath a very broken system to the Biden administration. We've spent the last several years, people across the country, we've come to a greater appreciation to which racism, things like racism, drive systemic policy. And we're also more conscious that racism has driven a lot of immigration policy, and how a lot of these policies like MPP are driven by a politics of xenophobia. Racism requires systemic change. We can't just be bickering and arguing about budgets, lowering enforcement budgets. We need to go further, and we need deep change. It's difficult. I recognize that the political situation is difficult. We're still waiting on the election of senators in the state of Georgia. We have a divided government, we have a divided Congress, but this can be, if we rally together, a shoot for the fences moment where we can begin to make some of those structural changes that we really need to have. We cannot allow ourselves to be hypnotized by complexity, and we cannot allow complexity to be something that the administration uses as an excuse for inaction. We need to continue to press them. And then finally, we need to address root causes. We cannot have substantive immigration debates without addressing the border. We all agree on that. That's why we're having this conversation, and I'm glad JFI is hosting this. But we also need to recognize that we need often implicated. If we don't address root causes, we will continue to have flows to the border that we will need to address, and that will be inflected through the political debates that we have in this country. We need to address those substantially. We need to address things like climate change, mitigating the effects of hurricanes like we've seen in the last couple of weeks. We need to address things like human rights and democracy. We need to address things like stemming the flow of drugs north and addressing our consumption of those drugs, et cetera, et cetera. All of those root causes which are driving migration north. We're involved in a coalition which includes Father Sean and Sister Norma, partners on the ground, grassroots communities in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. Our partners here in the United States, Faith in Action. We're beginning to develop positive proposals to address root causes, and I invite all of you, send me an email. I'll put my email in the chat. If you want to sign on to the framework for change that we've created and that we're going to be pursuing over the next year, I invite you to join us in that work. We need everybody on deck and on board. I think I'll stop there and turn it back over to Ashley.
Thanks, Dylan. And a big thanks to all of our panelists. Before we get started with the good questions that have been presented, I want to follow up with a couple housekeeping items. This webinar is going to be recorded. It's going to be available at www.justiceforimmigrants.org. We will be sending out a follow-up email with the recording, as well as with the proposal that Dylan mentioned, to you all once we get the recording done. Some of you mentioned there was some difficulty with the audio. We are going to work to try and up the audio so you can hear everybody in the recording. But overall, again, we're very pleased that you were able to participate. Please look for our follow-up email. And I'm gonna start by answering a couple quick questions that we can dispatch with. One is, can you repeat the approximate number of people forced to wait on the Mexico side of the border due to MPP? The data point I gave was 65,000. I said a little bit more. It is 68,000, and I get that data from the TRACK project at Syracuse University. I will put it in a link for you to see. But since October 2020, they estimate that 68,430 people have been put into the MPP program and are in various stages of waiting. So I will follow up in a written answer with that. Another one, Joseph Onafer says, is there a foster program associated with any of our ministries? The USCCB, in partnership with Catholic Charities around the country, does run foster care program for unaccompanied children and unaccompanied refugee minor programs. I will send you a link to that. The providers here on this call do not provide that type of work, but they do work with a lot of those individuals. And we do, as I said, particularly care for unaccompanied children and then unaccompanied refugee children. So I'll send you a link. So then we have a couple questions that I want to give to our speakers about a couple different things. Two themes are really coming out from these questions. One is, this is a question that's from Claudia Tristan, and she says, Christmas week of 2018 saw an unexpected mass release of asylum seekers where ICE literally dumped hundreds of migrants in downtown El Paso at a time when your network shelters were not alerted and or prepared. Dylan, as you know, representing El Paso and Hope here, very familiar with this. Some of the panelists have mentioned prepared shelters have decreased over the year due to MPP and COVID. Is there a fear that Christmas 2018 could repeat itself this year? And before the panelists, I ask you to answer this. It does very much align with another a gentleman's question of, he asked a question here about if the policy changes occur, will they, if Trump, Rose Therese Nolta said, if Trump's policies are rolled back, how will this be for you? So a question, I think, rolling those questions together and mindful of our time is, do you anticipate as the numbers go up to be ready in terms of helping to be able to process individuals? And if so, what sort of help for those who are watching on the webinar would be most useful to you?
I'll start a little bit with that. So even DHS officials anticipate that there is going to be a surge of individuals who are going to be admitted into the United States. They, you know, their concern is the same as all of our concern is, how does COVID play into that and what does it do for the capacity issues in place? I don't think there will be the ability to have the same volume of individuals processed through DHS as there were in the late fall and winter of 2018, because we all experienced that very high volume. DHS is going to have some procedures in place within their own facilities that will effectively limit the number of folks that they can bring in and process through ERO and then release in. We don't know what that's like, and DHS doesn't know what that's like, really. they're still having those conversations and asking us, frankly, what our feedback is on the capacity. But we are going to have to provide multiple reception sites for folks, where before we might have had one single processing center or welcome center, if you will. There's now going to be models in place, such as Sister Norma was talking about, where folks might end up being all brought to like a hotel or something, and kind of screened out through there, or screened out through a welcoming center. And for us, we're going to have to assume that everybody has been COVID exposed, even the folks who are not symptomatic, because that is the reality of this pandemic. And so we are not necessarily going to be able to count on DHS being able to screen those individuals themselves, because frankly, they haven't had a lot of success in that, at least within our community. So we'll be needing to work extensively with the public health officials within our own communities to advise and assist us as they determine how these individuals are coming into the communities, and then how we're going to be able to provide effective, kind of categorization of the work that we do.
Thanks, Teresa. I think that's great. Do any other panelists want to respond? I think there has been a lot of work by providers to think about what the new reality will be like. And your answer certainly is reflective of that thoughtful analysis. Do others care to respond?
Yes, I would just say something briefly. One is I think to be ready to process individuals, obviously not just in Nogales, but along the border. I think we need to, the whole question of the list has to be clear. The list needs to be clarified and processed. In fact, we've started meeting with Mexican migration here to precisely zero in on that question, because I think once it starts, that's really important, so that people know where they are in line, and so that hopefully they can be processed as expeditiously as possible while respecting their rights. I think another is the coordination. I think between where we are on the border, for example, like those who are providing service in Mexico on the border, and those in the U.S., I think is going to be important, so that those providers in the U.S. have a sense of how many people are being processed per day, and just really what's happening there, and kind of what are the, they already know what the supports that they need, but I think just information we could provide from the border would be helpful. And then for us too, on the border, kind of in places like Catholic Community Services in Tucson, or Catholic Charities in the Rio Grande Valley, the providing service on the U.S. side, the Respite Center, what are they seeing in terms of needs and the realities. But I think that coordination is going to be important. And then obviously, on the Mexican side of the border, providing the appropriate supports that people need so their humanitarian needs, and then trying as much as possible to provide them the best information on what is happening. We have a wonderful collaboration with the Florence Immigrant Refugee Rights Project. That legal information that people can receive is just really helpful, so that it empowers them to make the best decisions possible. And I think in terms of help, I think we'll have to see what would be most helpful, but I think targeted or particularly in-kind assistance will be really helpful, especially if we see the number of people increase, which I think we will, and just being aware of kind of what are their particular humanitarian needs that they have.
Thank you so much. So, go ahead, sister.
Just quickly, I don't know if your question was in line with would the same thing happen this Christmas that it happened when in El Paso, when families were just dumped. I don't foresee that happening anymore. As far as dumping people just in great numbers, I think that the reason why that happened back then, when in El Paso, it also happened with us here in the Rio Grande Valley, when Border Patrol took the different lead in dropping people off at bus stations without notifying anybody. It was as a means of deterrence and of creating something that there was actual problems at the border, and the administration wanted to show that by doing those kinds of actions. Presently, what I know of, people are being deported in great numbers to Honduras and Guatemala and Salvador and all these places. And so right now, because of the hurricanes, those airports are blocked and underwater. So they have been holding back from deporting. But I think their natural course under this administration will continue until the new administration kicks in, that people will be deported. And so I don't foresee great numbers of people just being dropped off. We are getting calls. We have 80 people that we will be releasing to you in the next couple of weeks. So I think right now they're more collaborative in working with us than just taking an initiative to create chaos.
Thank you very much. So one of the other questions that's a big theme here, and I'm going to group it together. This is an all Catholic, all star panel here. And all of the individuals on this call have represented entities that were called on to help reunite families in the summer of 2018 and lead assistance by the bishops and by the USCCB. And then there are many people on also listening who were participating in the interior who provided us services and assistance. There's several questions in the chat about what's next in terms of how are we as Catholic service providers, but also as part of the NGO community that cares for migrants and refugees, how are we to organize and see this through to help ensure that the safe release and care and treatment of individuals, fleeing violence, but then once they leave Sister Norma or Teresa and Casalitas, what's next for them? And what is the role of Catholic organizations in providing this? It is a conversation that we have started having at USCCB. And I think given the leadership that you all provide, it would be great, I think, to hear your thoughts on, what is the possibility for us to create a network of from arrival, initial respite, services to help individuals thrive and also comply with their immigration court proceedings outside of the detention context in the United States. I know it's a big one, but as our closing panelist, Dylan said, it is the time to dream big. So a number of questions have related around that, and I would welcome just your commentary or your thoughts about it or your experience from our initial little effort in that summer of 2018, and kind of maybe that's the way forward for us to think about.
Well, I would like to say a couple of things real quickly and let Dylan finalize the complete picture or anyone else. I definitely think that we must weave together a network in the whole United States. So whatever starts at the border can continue through to their points of destination, and that we can establish something that works, some kind of case management or some kind of a responsibility that we all take to make sure those families are accompanied along the way, to make sure that they show up to court, to make sure that they have the needs met wherever they are. And so I think that would be an ideal, wonderful plan. And I think it can work if we all work together. So Dylan, you can add.
Thank you, sister. Yeah, I would just, in 2018, it was, the burden was very substantial. But one of the beautiful things was to see the sort of the roads that were traveled from the border to the interior. So I saw in the call, Sister Sharon from San Antonio, so folks would come to Laredo or Brownsville, and then they would go to San Antonio because of the overflow. Or we had folks from El Paso who had to go up into Albuquerque. And so relationships were built with border communities here in El Paso, and then the folks up in Albuquerque. And the same thing happened all across the border. You had sort of these new highways of charity and justice that were built from the border into the interior. I think as as possibly some legalization opportunities open up over the next year, as folks are going to have the need for more legal services, we're going to need our Catholic charities agencies in the whole country to step up in unprecedented ways. And I think that could be a real opportunity to build relationships with communities here at the border and agencies and providers here at the border, to build some sort of continuity of care. You know, the Holy Father famously, you know, brought in a couple refugees into the Vatican after a trip that he made to one of the Greek islands that was receiving a lot of migrants. And then he challenged every parish in Europe to take in a couple refugees. You know, if our Catholic agencies can stand up to provide those different wraparound services, legal, integration into the community, assistance with work, trauma and counseling. A lot of these folks need trauma and counseling and recovery long term. Be a real, you know, inflection point, a renewal, a moment of renewal for our Catholic Church and our agencies throughout the country.
All right, so we're at time, but we still have quite a number of speakers. Are there any last words that people would like to say, just given from your vantage point and the amazing work that you personally and your organizations have done to help immigrants and refugees and what you see as the road before you?
Yeah, I would just say and it's been mentioned here, but I think the preparation needs to happen now, and just like Dylan said, and Sister Norma as well. I mean, we have the capacity to do this, and we have the capacity to respond well, to do it in a coordinated way, and really in a way that's grounded in who we are and in our faith and in that deep respect for God-given human dignity, and I think that's going to drive our efforts and our preparations in the weeks ahead, and I really see the preparation and coordination along with the advocacy working hand in hand, and because as Dylan's mentioned, we just I mean, there's the potential for improvement, but we can't just assume that's going to happen. We need to be active. We need to be united and speaking with one voice. And I think as we do that and as we prepare, I think we will see the fruit of that. So just really grateful to be part of this.
Thank you. Any other words? We're at 4:03. Okay, thanks again for those of you who tuned in. We are going to be sending the web recording to everybody who registered. It will be available at justiceforimmigrants.org. We also will be sending other materials that the panelists mentioned, and we will continue to have more webinar series like this as we lead up to a new administration. Thank you again, and a round of applause to our wonderful speakers and leaders at the US-Mexico border. So thank you and have a nice day.